Welcome to Law Subscribed. This is your dedicated news source for all things subscriptions and the law. My name is Matthew Kurbis. I'm the subscription attorney, and I believe subscriptions can help bridge the access to justice gap and incentivize attorneys to modernize and scale their practice like never before. In this episode, I interview Liam Gill. Liam is a lawyer and a serial entrepreneur. Liam is still practicing law, but spends most of his time as a founder and sharing his legal knowledge with other founders to help them think like a lawyer. We talk about Liam's several entrepreneurial endeavors, why he's used the subscription model and its benefits, and even cover everyone's favorite current topic, artificial intelligence. Thank you to my sponsors, 650 and Gavel, links to both in the show notes, and more on them later. You can sign up for the waitlist for my subscription seminar at subscriptionseminar.com. Your ability to sign up for the waitlist is almost over, with pricing and training starting in July of 2023, so get in while there's still room. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only, and nothing said is legal, ethical, or financial advice. Without further delay, here's the episode. Liam Gill, I'm so happy to have you on Law Subscribed. Welcome to the show. Please, would you introduce yourself to my listeners?
Yeah, glad to be here. I know it's been a few months in the making. Glad we were finally able to put the time aside to make it happen. For those who don't know about me, my name is Liam. I'm a lawyer. So I got my law degree in the UK, later got a master's of law in Canada, and in the middle of that, ended up with a master's of science, actually. So did a lot in the education sector, currently a practicing lawyer in British Columbia, Canada. But I've also previously had my own tech startup, so grew that to $35 million, left that company, and now actually do multiple things. So in addition to actually my own practice, I focus specifically on sharing legal information and teaching the way that lawyers think to entrepreneurs. A lot of that comes from my experience as an entrepreneur, seeing others not being able to analytically solve business problems, as well as for the lawyers out there, a very interesting Harvard study I once read, which showed that lawyers, so those with JDs, outperform those with MBAs in Fortune 500 companies as CEO. That's both in terms of they have less lawsuits, less costs, higher return on investment. So I think that learning that legal way of thinking is very beneficial for entrepreneurs. And most recently, in the last 2-3 years, been focusing a lot on building subscription-based and AI-based software to automate legal services for those entrepreneurs as well.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so much there to unpack, but I could start with just, it's always great to meet a kindred spirit, because I am a man of many hats and many talents and skills as well, and I can't just stay in my in like one lane. I can't do it.
Yeah, no, I find it like really interesting, and like for a long time, I view them as like opposing forces. The fact that I went to law school, and the way I tell the story normally is I went to law school, had a vacation scheme, which for those in the US who aren't familiar with them, is a thing in the UK where in the Christmas or Easter break before you graduate, you go and work for a week or two at a law firm where you're going to end up doing, signing your first contract. And I did that week and absolutely hated it. I remember very clearly, we walked into the firm, and the first thing they did was they handed us these little plastic pouches, which had like shaving cream and like all this like sort of toiletries. And they were like, you're going to need this because there's going to be a few all-nighters in the next week. And so for me, like when I started my career, there was this balance between, I love the law, I love jurisprudence, like the philosophy of the law, I love the role of the law. Like I think it's almost like politics, but 100 times more interesting to me. And I always just found it very interesting. And at the same time, I never wanted to practice law. I was far more focused on being an entrepreneur, building something of value. I kind of view those as opposing. And I'm kind of at a point in my career now where I've found a way to merge my interest in law, my interest in entrepreneurship, and bring them together to actually provide legal services and legal information and legal products to entrepreneurs and help them innovate and grow.
Yeah, and it's hard for me to hear them handing you the toiletries and not think about, it's because you have to like be there billing your time, right? Like that was the expectation. Yeah, and so I'm trying to build with this podcast, and this in the community I'm trying to build is to move away from that whole philosophy of how to practice law, right? And that expectation. How are we going to compete with the 4-day work week as a profession? When we're given, whatever, I don't know, summer associates or whatever you call them in the UK, here's your toiletries because you're going to be spending the night to bill hours.
Yeah, it's really weird, especially as someone who started in the law, went into starting my own company, was living in Silicon Valley, driving the Tesla, living with my co-founders in a condo, leave the company, decide I want to go back into law. And suddenly I'm back in like an office wearing a suit every day, 9 to 5. If I'm lucky, most days, let's be honest, it was like 8 to 8. And, like focused about tracking all the time. It's like a very different environment. I think one is very conductive to creative thinking and problem solving. And one of them is conductive to essentially billing hours and not much more in my experience.
Yeah, and we will get into what you're doing now and some of the stuff that you've done, but I first have to ask, how is it to not be billing your time since you've been there and done that?
Yeah, well, I will admit that in my legal practice, there are some clients that I do bill time for still. So I don't want to like pretend as if I've like solved the problem and that, I found the ultimate solution for it. I do tend to keep 2 to 3 clients, long-term clients, which I work with. I'd say I budget like 5 to 10 hours a week to work with them. And some of them are on sort of more long-term projects, but when they do need a short-term, sort of sprint, whether that's a shareholders agreement or something like that, I do tend still to bill based off time. And the main reason for that is I genuinely can't think of a way of valuing my own time other than just billing for it. It's a bit of a hard one. So I will pull that out. I don't think that it's necessarily something that will just disappear. It's a very easy way of going about it. And for someone like me who does multiple things, when I do focus on doing lawyer work and specifically like drafting agreements or resolving legal issues for clients, like I still haven't come up with a better way of doing it. So I will put that out there. I don't, for the lawyers that do still bill their time and are listening to this, it's not looking down on that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but you don't need to sustain your lifestyle on the billable hour. So there is a little bit of a difference there, right?
Yeah, not at all. Like the billable hours for me are very much just me getting to do something I love in, the 5 to 10 hours a week I set aside for doing that.
Yeah. Well, I at the time we're recording, I'm coming off of just a few days, actually exactly a week after I presented at ABA Tech Show on the subscription model for lawyers, and I had somebody ask me about that kind of a thing during the presentation. But Liam, I'm going to text you a link to it so you can watch and be inspired to stop valuing your time and instead value the service you're providing and figure out how to put a price on it that your clients will be happy with, that you'll be happy with too. But moving on, so just to get the timeline straight, you were a lawyer when you started your business, or you started your business and then you decided you want to go and practice law?
Yeah, so so back to the original story, had that vacation scheme. So that was during my final year of law school. And that was for me 3 months before I graduated. And I had a contract in hand. And I gave myself essentially 3 months to come up with a business idea that had some validation. And if I could do that before I graduated law school, I'd start the business. And if I couldn't, then I'd go accept the contract, go into practice. And luckily for me, came up with an idea, was able to get it validated. So I was able to raise a few $1,000s, very little amount, but for me it was enough to justify not going down a career path I wasn't sure I necessarily wanted to do at the time. Started that business, did my master's in science simultaneously to running the business for the first year, moved to the Valley, ran the business for a couple more years. And then when I left it, I went back to law school in Canada and then went into practice again after that, and recently left a few months ago.
Got it. Okay. I'm interested in the business. How did that business make money that you made?
Subscriptions.
Hey,
it was a tech company, but it was subscriptions.
Wow. How surprising is that? I think, well, I genuinely, Liam and I did have a pre-show conversation months ago, but I don't always get that type of information. So that was a genuine, I just shot in the dark. So it's staying in the episode. Perfect. So the subscription model, well, why? So it was a software company. So it sounds like a tech company. Is that why you did the subscription model?
Yeah, it kind of went through a few iterations. The short of it is that I read this stat back in university that a computer is 99% efficient at producing heat. So that's why when you like put one on your lap and you're working for a bit, it'll like start feeling really hot and the fan will start blowing. And a traditional boiler in a house is only 87% efficient at the highest. Like that's a plus level boiler. The highest it can reach is 87% efficiency at creating heat. And I was like obsessed with this idea because we are living in a world where like computers are essentially using a lot of energy, creating a lot of heat. And then we're using all these fans to cool them while simultaneously like using boilers to heat homes. And it was like, I was kind of like, this is just a problem I had in my head. So the company actually started with like this idea and me trying to create boiler systems and heating systems that were powered by computers. So the idea was, instead of having a data center, which spent, crazy amount of money, millions of dollars, on computers and millions of dollars on cooling, you would essentially decentralize the data centers and have, a few computers in everyone's homes, in a locked boiler system, and then the heat from them would be used to heat their water in their house. So that's where the idea came from. What actually ended up making money was we had the problem of like how do you sell the software on those computers? So you essentially have to create an AWS equivalent to actually have people, validate having $20,000 boilers in their house at that point. So we built the software, which essentially is similar to cloud gaming software. So it allows you to remotely access high powered computers. And we built that for engineers and architects. And we would rent that out on a monthly basis. That was our subscription based company there.
Fascinating. Did you ever cross paths with anyone at Google, and that's why they decided to launch Stadia, which recently failed?
So this is the funny thing. So we were actually doing really well. Like we were raising funds. Everyone loved the idea, to the point where we actually had a housing company, the second largest one in the UK, who had agreed to like fund us and to like build the boiler systems out, put them in their homes. We built out the software. We had clients using the software. I would just say we were like a runaway success by any means. I think at one point we were listed in like the top 20 up and coming cloud computing companies by like Yahoo, and like we were doing really well. And then Stadia was announced, and we were in the middle of raising a multi-million-dollar round. And the moment Stadia was announced, everyone left us.
Wow.
Like investors were out the door. Everyone was out the door. And that's around the time where I left, and the company essentially got restructured under my co-founder. But Stadia was essentially the end of our company in a lot of ways. It was like the beginning of the end, because it was essentially the biggest fear any investors had when we had started the business was, how are you going to sustain this as soon as Amazon or Google start getting into this streaming of like high-end graphics, which is, cloud gaming and our application of it with engineers and architects.
Right. And of course, Stadia failed. So what Stadia should have done is Google should have just acquired, or Alphabet should have just acquired you. That's what should have happened.
Well, really interesting. Like, I know this is kind of going off topic.
No,
but,
it's okay.
Really interesting. One of our biggest competitors was this company called Parsec, and they were not doing the same thing on the hardware side as us, but they were on the software side. So they were into cloud gaming. I think they were one of the first actually to build this type of software we were using. And for a while, we actually licensed their software to test that it would work with architects and engineers. And they ended up, when our company changed course and Stadia sort of moved into cloud gaming, they actually ended up taking over the market we were originally in. So they pivoted into workplace and focusing on designers and architects, engineers, people who need to use the high-end CAD software essentially. And they ended up selling for 360 million a few years later. So maybe if investors had stayed on course with us, we would have had that big exit we were barreling towards at one point.
Well, that would make such a great transition point into the next topic. But you've tickled the back of my brain of my advanced placement environmental science class from high school, because like is a version of what you were talking about essentially cogeneration, right? Isn't that with like repurposing the heat, that's already being produced kind of a thing?
Yeah. So like the year that I started the company was the same year Microsoft first started testing underwater data centers. Mm-hmm. So like to explain like the scope of the problem was literally Microsoft wants to like build data centers and just dump them in the ocean because they produce so much heat, and computers obviously wear out with heat, that you need like some way of transferring that heat and getting rid of it. So for us, it was very much that. It was the idea that like it makes no sense that the largest cost for running a home currently in North America and Europe is heating.
Right.
It's like higher. It's the biggest like in-home expense for everyone.
Yeah, and
it's simultaneously the biggest expense in the tech industry.
Yeah, I'm enamored with the problem solving that is, we're already having this byproduct, right? And like being able to not have to necessarily double up, right? If we're already generating this much heat and we need heat, right? And that sort of efficiency mindset really does lend itself well to the subscription model, bringing it back full circle, right? And so you pivoted and you got into teaching entrepreneurs about law stuff and to think more like lawyers, right? Law school, what do you get when you go to law school? They teach you how to think like a lawyer. They don't teach you how to practice law. They don't teach you how to run a law firm. They don't teach you how to get clients, but they teach you how to think like a lawyer. And so you decided that you're going to do this for entrepreneurs because you've been in both seats. And so when I hear that, I think like Khan Academy for everyday people, but like for legal services, right? Or for like legal knowledge, like what Khan Academy did for math and science and other things. Like you're trying to do that, but teach entrepreneurs about law. Is that an apt analogy?
In a way. So I think there's, I think the best way of explaining it is probably to go back to the reason I started doing it, which was when we raised our first round for that company, It was $100,000. Obviously, as the founder and director of the company, I'm not allowed to actually be the lawyer for the company, which I wasn't too happy about. But we ended up actually spending, given it was a hardware aspect of it, a software aspect of it, there's a lot of I think we had 3 patents for the technology we built. So out of that first 100,000, I think we spent something around 60,000 on legal fees in total. I know 40% went to a single law firm. And when I left the company, and I'm sort of reflecting on, what happened between me starting it and me getting to a point where someone else was running it, I I really singled that out as like, you have $100,000 to develop an innovative technology, and 40% of it went to this one person who is doing nothing to actually advance the innovation in the company. I'm not saying obviously they didn't provide any value at all, but they're not like providing the innovative side of what is a tech company that's meant to be creating new things to help the world. Like they're not doing that part of it. Mm-hmm. So I found that really, really interesting. And as a result, when I left the company, I kind of took 6 to 7 months off before actually, going back to do my master's and starting to, work at Insight, starting to create content. And in those 6 months, I wrote a collection of about 40 contracts and posted them online. So they were just contract templates. And that was the original Law for Startups. Was I just put a website and I said, here's like 40 templates. And any lawyer, or like any entrepreneur who wants these, anyone who doesn't want to pay a lawyer, anyone who just needs to get deals in place, here's some, like, just take it. It's free. There was nothing attached to it. You didn't even have to drop an email. Like, you could just go and download it. And after a month, I think the site had something like 5,000 people on 1 week that had come onto it to look at it. And that's when I started realizing that there's like really something there in terms of entrepreneurs have a problem in the way that they approach the legal system and the way that they interact with the legal system. The fact that they're like literally willing to trust someone who's just dumped documents online more than they are to like go and speak with an actual lawyer. Like, that's a real problem. I think that's one that like lawyers sometimes don't understand, is that there's a real, I know people are aware of the negative perception towards the industry sometimes, but the extent of it and the extent to which people will go to avoid working with lawyers, I think, is sometimes surprising. So that's when I put the email link, people could start subscribing, and just started talking to people. And the two things that really stood out was people needed essentially legal information and legal templates and services. So they needed a way of knowing the law and being able to write documents. And number two was, the more I talked to them, the more I realized that many entrepreneurs didn't know how to actually approach the problems that they had. And that's kind of where like legalpreneurship and the idea of teaching people to think like a lawyer comes in, is that I think that's the best thing I learned in law school. And I think that's the reason I've been successful even outside of the legal profession, is that I think lawyers and engineers specifically are taught a way of problem solving, of here's a problem, let's break it down. Let's like take a structured approach to determining the best way to solve the problem. And they're very successful in applying that method all across their lives. And I think that's the same reason you see many presidents are lawyers, many CEOs are lawyers. I think it's just an analytical method that is going to set you up for success. And most people who go to business school or go to any other education don't have that. I don't think you'd learn that in business school. Like, having gone to business school, I never learned that way of thinking. You learn some soft skills, you learn accounting, you learn finance, but none of those, once you get into the real world, are actually ever that important, because you've got a CFO doing that stuff. Like, as the CEO, you might need it to learn to read balance sheets and whatnot, but to make strategic decisions, I think like a law degree is significantly more valuable, and learning how to think like a lawyer is significantly more valuable for a CEO.
Well, great job pandering to my audience. I think we all agree with you, since we're mostly lawyers here. But no, I do agree with that. And I've often tried to figure out like, what can I do? And I've even in my own, since I don't make much money from the podcast. I have a law firm, a solo practice, and so I try to do content creation in order to drive business to my firm. And one of the things I recently discovered is just getting out there and talking about contract negotiations. Like, here are terms in a contract, and like, here's how you negotiate, and here's ways to make them in favor of you, or here's ways to make them more mutual, and like just explaining what indemnification is. Like, I market to a lot of freelancers because I have low-cost, predictable, affordable legal services, and that makes sense for other solopreneurs. And so, like, they eat that up because they are negotiating their own contracts because they want those relationships with their clients. But I offer unbundled legal services to them, where I could take out the negotiation aspect and charge a low predictable price where I'm just helping them draft and redline their contracts on their behalf. So even if, and then if they decide all the stuff you're teaching me is too much for me to remember to do, I'm just going to hire you. And then they could bundle that back in with negotiation. So like in my own experimentation with just teaching my market about the legal information stuff and the ways to think like a lawyer is starting to pay dividends. And that's just in a very narrow focus of freelancers. So what has been your experience then? Because you're and freelancers are entrepreneurs in their own way, lifestyle businesses, right? But like, what has been some of the feedback that you've gotten from your subscribers, even just newsletter subscribers, about the information that you're providing and the value that it's giving?
Yeah, I think when we're specifically talking about like this concept of legalpreneurship and helping people think more like a lawyer, there's a really good example from, I'm actually going to write about this on Sunday in the newsletter. Often, I know this will be published a few months from now. There's this woman who messaged me, I want to say about 2 weeks ago, and she had just started a company and she'd been sent a cease and desist because they claimed she'd infringed on the trademark. And she messaged and she was like, I need to defend myself. I need to, like, there's this general, I don't know if this is being unaware of your legal rights and obligations, but there's a general position that almost all non-lawyers take, I've observed, where they're very combative when it comes to the law. They kind of view, like, they look at TV and they see everyone like fighting in a courtroom and they're like, as soon as there's a legal issue, I gotta like stand my ground and like, this is like we're going to battle. And that's like the way that a lot of people approach a lot of strategic decisions, actually, is they've kind of been taught that like capitalism is like this zero-sum game and like it's all about fighting, and they never really like stop to think about what's actually the best value proposition for them. Sometimes you take a loss because it's actually like a win when you change your mindset and look a more of a long-term mindset. So for this one, she'd invested like, I think, less than $100 in the site. It'd been up for a week, and someone was coming to her with a cease and desist, threatening to like sue, and she wanted to essentially like fight. And I was like, listen, you've invested like $100. If you want me to write a demand letter, the minimum I'm going to charge you is $1,000. Like, that's the lowest end here. And then they're going to reply, or their lawyer's going to want to call, and that's going to take a few hours of my time, and you're going to be charged another $1,000. Then we're going to have to go to like a negotiation. And then they're probably going to, like, I was like, by the time that you even have an idea of like the depth of this problem, you're going to have sunk another like $3,000 to $5,000 into this. So like, how much value does this domain actually have to you? And we had a chat for about like 30-40 minutes. At the end of it, she realized like, maybe just walking away is the highest value thing. And then, this is sort of the legalpreneurship aspect of it, is the thing that, I suggested, which I don't think any non-lawyers would really come around to, or very few would come around to, was why don't you just offer to sell the domain? Like, that's clearly important to them. You've invested very little in it. The value to them is significantly higher than the value to you. Why don't you just turn around and offer them, tell them they're going to spend like $3,000 to $5,000 on legals. Why don't they just give you $1,500? And you sell the domain in like 2 weeks, you've made like $1,400. You just go and start the business under a different name on a new domain, and you're like way ahead. Like, it's more than you would have expected in sales in those few weeks.
Yeah, and that's great. That's great business advice. Like sure, there's legal wrapped up in that, but it's not just thinking like a lawyer. And I think when I think there's limiting beliefs for attorneys too. And what you're talking about is not just useful for non-lawyers. I think it's useful for a lot of lawyers to think about that, because if they just think about the legal aspect of it, and they're only incentivized, and kudos to you for giving the good business advice, because lawyers who only make money when they're billing time are not incentivized to bring their clients to that type of a result.
Yeah, well, this is kind of where I'm at, is that I think the legal industry as a whole, this kind of the divide is that if you take this to a traditional lawyer, that's the problem, is that a lawyer will want to bill. So a lawyer's option there is either to give what is likely the best legal advice, which is just drop this. Honestly, like, it's not worth it. Or let's go for this, and they make thousands of dollars, and the client at the end is potentially left just down thousands of dollars. Obviously there's another scenario where they win and potentially recoup legal costs, but at the end of the day, the most likely outcome is either the attorney makes money and the client makes no money, or everyone loses like a very little bit, right? Like, that's the legal perspective of it. But
right,
being able to, as an entrepreneur, think like a lawyer, you come up with that middle ground, which only makes sense for the entrepreneur, not for the lawyer, but is not a way that entrepreneurs tend to think. It's a way that lawyers tend to think. So that's kind of my goal here is to make it so that entrepreneurs who are in those scenarios can analyze the problem the same way that a lawyer would and come to the solution that doesn't actually benefit the lawyer but would benefit them on their own.
And this is just a really good like hypothetical real situation, but let's keep examining it. So I think what you said is right. A lot of lawyers would look at it and they could be like, I can make thousands of dollars from like this one legal problem that's come to me if you're billing your time. With the subscription model and the way I've designed my practice, just to use it as an example for this hypothetical, is that client, if they're in Illinois or this issue's in Illinois, they could sign up with me at $20 a month and they could schedule a 15-minute consultation where they could tell me their facts and I'll give them real legal advice. If they want me to send a demand letter, for me, it's only going to cost $250. And why is that? Because I'm thinking about lifetime value, LTV, in the subscription economy, right? I'm not thinking about making a lot of money one time from this one client's one legal problem. I'm thinking about keeping this client happy because they're not just going to come back to me for this one demand letter. This is not my only thing. I could represent them in other things. They have this business. They want to start another business. So by making them a subscriber and offering more than just the demand letter or more than just trying to extract as much water from this stone as I can, I'm thinking about, let's create a long-term relationship now with this client. And maybe we do, and maybe it makes sense. Maybe she's willing to send a demand letter. I just sent a demand letter for a client where I told them, well, you don't have the facts to win this. I will argue the law within my ethical boundaries to try to get you the result that you want. But if they lawyer up, you're not going to get what you want. Yeah. But it's only going to cost you $250. And so we did it. And certainly they had lawyered up. They sent back a demand letter or a response to our demand letter. And they said everything they needed to say that I already told my client. Right. Yeah. And I said, if it's any consolation, I think you cost them at least $1,000. Yeah. And he was like, I'm fine with that. That's cool with me. So sometimes, also depending on how you, like you said, how you define success. Sometimes the success was we tried, we lost, but I properly advised, and this is a subscriber. And so, when they need other things, they will come to me. That's the idea anyway. What do you think about that kind of a way to approach it? When I went solo, I pivoted from mostly litigation to a transactional-only practice. I did not have a database of documents to automate. That's why a business and employment legal document database and automation tool like 650 is super useful. I can rely on the quality of the documents in 650's database since they're putting excellent legal minds to work curating and updating their documents and automations over time. When you're not billing by the hour, outsourcing and efficiency matters, and 650 can help you scale your practice to get high-quality documents drafted in less time. Use the code LAWSubscribed at 650.com and when being onboarded to get 10% off. If you're not a business and employment attorney, or you have your own documents that you'd prefer to use, then my next sponsor, Gavel, is the automation tool for you. Gavel allows you to build shareable, client-facing workflow and document automations. In other words, Gavel helps you create a legal practice where attorneys can monetize the value they bring clients in productized form at scale via subscriptions and flat fees. Use the code LAWSubscribed at gavel.io to get 10% off an annual subscription. There's no one right way to automate and scale your practice, but with one or both of my sponsors, 650 and Gavel, you can take your subscription law firm to the next level. Links to both in the show notes. Now back to the show.
Yeah, I think honestly, this kind of is very lawyerly to say, but it comes down to what the client wants, right? At the end of the day, if she had wanted a demand letter or she'd wanted, some sort of reply to the cease and desist, and that was her position, then obviously the choice between her having to pay thousands of dollars for it, or $250, the $250 makes a lot more sense. But I think what I'm trying to do long term is get to a point where entrepreneurs can find the best solution themselves. And I think the data is quite clear, especially when you look at these studies of Fortune 500 CEOs, the way that the ones with law degrees versus MBAs think and the way they run their companies is very clear that the lawyers tend to make the better decisions and tend to approach the problems and come up with unique and better solutions to them. I can't think of any business-minded person I've met who would have come up with that solution of why don't we flip and sell the domain. I think even if we're generalizing, I think maybe 5% of business people would have come up with that. I think from my experience, over half of the lawyers I know would come up with that solution, because we're just taught to analyze, what does everybody in the situation want, and what is like the happy medium. Like we're almost taught to think almost like mediators or arbitrators, and obviously we often take one side, but we have to be aware of like what the other side's thinking, what the other side wants to ever be successful. And I don't think business people who are always taught like to stand their ground, to fight, to maximize their own value, they're not often taught this way of thinking, which is understand what the other person wants, understand what you want, understand the cost of both sides, understand the best options for both sides, the worst options for both sides, and find what like works best for everyone. That's that whole way of thinking and analyzing a problem isn't necessarily something that I think is practiced outside the legal profession. And unfortunately, the way the legal profession is, lawyers aren't often incentivized to actually like put that whole thing in practice and reach that optimal solution. They're taught to put that all in practice and then find a way of getting the best deal possible for their client and to bill the most hours for themselves. Like those are where the incentives are. So I just think like society as a whole would be significantly better if you had more people who were making business decisions, making political decisions, who had the ability to think like that and were actually able to move forward with what was the optimal or best decision.
I mean, it sounds to me like you might be running for office and saying that we need more civics education in younger years in school in K through 12.
I just find it really interesting the way that like lawyers think, the way the lawyers are successful. I think like the stat that really stands out to me, like going back to that study of like CEOs, is on average, companies run by CEOs with legal degrees have 48% less active litigation, and at most within Fortune 100 companies, they had 76% less than the average. And I think that shows that the reputation of lawyers or of the legal profession as being like very litigious, being very confrontational, isn't started by lawyers. It's not like a lawyerly thing. Obviously, there's a lot of incentive for lawyers to act in that way sometimes. It increases billables, can extend, the disputes so that there's more time, actually spent arguing sides. But I think that actually does come from clients. I think that's clients who have spent their entire life watching TV and watching, or hearing about, Supreme Court cases, and they're always hearing the extreme cases, the ones where it's like two people ideologically opposed fighting for like what's right, and they like take that approach on every small issue. But when you actually give lawyers a chance to run their own businesses, to actually make decisions that will impact them and like society as a whole, like the data is very clear that they actually do the right thing and come to the optimal solution more often than not. Mm-hmm. So I think that's just like it's just mind-boggling to me again when you're talking about like sort of like the computer heating and cooling. It's the same thing to me. It's like it's very clear that lawyers have a way of thinking that, if applied across society, would make society better. So why is it that we've created an incentive system where the only people who have taught that way of thinking are somehow incentivized not to actually use it in practice?
Yeah. Enter the subscription model for legal services, but also, tizing legal services in other ways, or legal information and legal. That's right. And so that brings us back to law for startups and legalpreneurship. I mean, like, these are your brands. Speak a little bit more to like what these are, what the goals are. And I mean, are you really ultimately just competing with LegalZoom, but like really niching down? Is like that what it is, kind of to help my listeners understand what it is?
Yeah. So there's three legal softwares or brands that I run, all focused on entrepreneurs. The first one is actually launching in a couple of weeks from the time of recording, so we'll have been out probably a couple months by the time this goes out. Mm-hmm. is actually called $1contract.com, and it's an AI lawyer based on GPT 3.5. So it's not based on the same stuff as ChatGPT. It's based on the slightly more advanced version, and that has been in the works for I think 6 to 8 months now. The idea has been there for about 2 years, but actually building the AI, building the software has been there for 6 to 8 months. And what that is we've taken an AI, we've trained it on essentially all of the legal documents that we could find free online, hundreds of documents that I've written. And we've essentially taught a lawyer how to write very basic contracts.
An AI, you said taught a lawyer how to write basic contracts.
An AI how to write very basic contracts. And the idea there is essentially that I think that there's a range of people in society that don't have access to legal services. The example being, let's say you loan a friend $1,000. You're not going to a lawyer to get a contract for $1,000 loan. It's going to cost you, half of that, if not more, just to get the contract. So this is like a great one where it's like $1. You can put in the names of the parties, the terms of the loan, and it'll auto-generate a contract that you can just sign online. So that's kind of aiming to service a portion of society that I don't think would ever have gone to the legal industry in the first place. And I'm hoping that it actually does end up serving as almost a stepping stone. So it helps more people and entrepreneurs get started, get their legals, get documents and agreements on paper, so that when they actually do end up raising funds and growing their business, that there's a bit of a legal foothold to jump off of. And I'm hoping that actually makes life easier for the lawyers that end up working with those people in future.
Yeah, I think somebody who like sometimes has to deal with oral contracts, like even just having anything in writing.
Yeah.
I'd rather they come to me like legal subscription model for legal services means hopefully they're coming to you because they're already paying you a little bit per month to come to you anyway. But if they did come to me, I'd rather have something in writing than nothing. And and this is, I mean, yeah, there is, no matter how low cost you make legal services, even with the subscription model, there's still going to be a demand for what you're talking about here. And frankly, I also see the opportunity for lawyers to use products like this to offer even lower cost legal services. So like, have you been looking at also like trying to partner with innovative lawyers who are willing to bring this to their clients as like an added value? So like for my subscribers, I've been looking at Termageddon. So Termageddon is $10 a month. Anyone could go sign up and use it. They don't do COPPA, but they do compliance for all the other privacy laws. But they also have decided to partner with lawyers so lawyers can buy licenses and give it to their clients or sell it to their clients. And I'm looking at just packaging that with a certain level of one of my subscribers to just make it a subscriber benefit. So as subscription attorneys become more and more of a thing, have you thought about licensing it to lawyers to use to make it part of their subscription benefit? Hey, subscribe with us and you get access to $1contract.com, something like that.
Yeah. So at the moment we haven't. The only conversations we've kind of had in the legal profession with it is potentially partnering with some firms to give them access to use internally. Because one of the things that is quite beneficial that some lawyers have found who've tested it is it can almost do the work of a first-year associate when it comes to drafting very specific clauses in a contract. So I'm sure you've been there before, maybe listening have been, where like your client just wants like a very specific payment term with like a very specific earn-out schedule or something. And in this scenario, you can just write that. You can tell the AI, like, this is the term I want, and it'll come up with that term within the contract. And it's been quite useful for that, because you can essentially explain the way you want the term to be written in like 10 different ways. Each contract takes less than a minute to generate. And for $10, so $1 for each one, you've got essentially the work that might have taken a first year 3 to 4 hours, and you're probably paying them far more than $3 an hour or whatever the cost ends up being.
Yeah.
So you're getting it faster and cheaper. So
there's a labor crunch. About that. There's a labor crunch right now in the legal profession. We're not pumping out enough lawyers, and enough lawyers aren't staying in the profession because billing time is terrible and it creates burnout. And so this sounds like a great tool to use for law firms, especially ones where if they're only billing time, the only way to scale is to hire more lawyers. And you can't just keep hiring more lawyers. So this tool sounds not just useful for, lower income or smaller dollar deals between individuals, but it's also, what you're telling me sounds like every law firm should sign up and use this product too.
Yeah. Well, the hope is that we can kind of like pivot it out into a commercial offering at some point. But yeah, for now it'll be online within a few weeks. So, it should be online by the time this comes out. And yeah, just go check it out. It's the first contract you get is free, so you can just sign up. All you need is an email, no credit card to try it out. And I write on the site, I think that this is not something to fear for lawyers. I think that this is just an insight into the way the technology industry is working. And this is, I've given like a few interviews on AI and tech in the past few weeks, just as AI has become quite trendy. I think that there's like a real misconception around AI and the legal industry. A lot of lawyers are concerned about it potentially replacing them and potentially incentivizing people to no longer use lawyers. But I think that there's a different way of looking at it, which is there's an entire group of people who lawyers can't often justify spending their time servicing. Like that's why, you often force to take pro bono cases and whatnot. And I think it's going to serve those people. And I think that if lawyers jump on AI early enough, it'll help them lower their costs and become more efficient. Still to this day, salary costs and the cost of associates is, I think, 30 to 40% of the cost of most firms. So you're able to essentially cut that entire cost down. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think if lawyers spend too much time pushing back on the technology, you're going to end up in a similar situation to banking, for example, where you're going to end up with someone with like a nice, hotshot technologist who has no legal background, kind of like do not pay. I don't think Joshua has any legal background, and
None.
just coming along and pretending like, look, I've built a lawyer in 2 months, like using technology. And the thing is, like, those stories will do well in the press, and it will actually have a negative impact on the industry as a whole. So I do think there's a lot of value to lawyers like changing the way they perceive technology and actually trying to learn about AI, trying to integrate it into the practices. Because I think the options really are either you do that now or you wait, 4 or 5, maybe up to 10 years and wait for someone else to come and just completely disrupt the entire industry. I think it's one of those two options. And I'm really hoping that the legal industry finds a way of integrating the tech early on and that lawyers still have a role essentially in society 10, 15 years from now.
Right. I mean, like, I feel like if I needed to clip any part of this interview, like, that's the part to clip and promote, right? Because I 100% agree with you. But one of the keywords that you used there was efficiency. You could help with efficiency, but efficiency is not something you're seeking when you're billing your time. And I think one of the reasons why we're getting so much pushback in the legal industry on like the tech that you're building is because they're like, well, it's going to cut against my billable hours. And eventually, and I gave this in my talk just a week ago, was whether it's in a year from now or 5 years or 10 years, eventually the way you can make money as a lawyer, you can make more money not billing time than billing your time in other ways. There will be a threshold that we cross at some point where you will no longer be able to make more money billing time. Do you want to be ready for it now? And if so, like, your tool and some of these other tools that are out there, some ones that come to mind that are like there's like Spellbook that's integrating with Word. LawDroid is one that's trying to use, I think they're using ChatGPT as like an AI co-pilot, I think they're calling it. So like there are some tools out there that are starting to adopt AI to help lawyers be more efficient, but that means you have to instead define what your value is that you're providing to your client with the support of these AI tools, and it's not just your time. It's the value that you're providing. And I think that's the way to bridge it. That's the way to avoid that dystopian future that you're talking about, Liam, where other disruptors come in and then lawyers don't have the same role to play in society anymore.
Yeah, I think one thing to consider as well, if you're like a lawyer listening to this who bills their time right now, and that's your primary way of making money, is that value-based billing on lower end deals is something you can very easily integrate and could actually make you more money. So if you think of these contracts, a very easy one is like a shareholders agreement. At least where I am, like a shareholders agreement in Vancouver, minimum any firm will charge is 2,000, probably 2,500. Like it just you would not be able to find anyone who would bill it for less. So if you're able to, let's say you value your time at $500 an hour, if you're able to use AI to make that type of agreement in 1 hour, 2 hours, you could still charge more than you would if you were billing time. Like you can start with these type of agreements where there's a minimum threshold. Like in corporations, one of them, like there's a minimum amount most lawyers will charge for a corporation. There's a minimum amount they'll charge for like a basic employment contract. Like there's this level of legal services which have almost these minimums in most markets, and you can start with those ones and essentially just increase the gap between your costs and what you're charging. And once you start doing that, you'll already be in a position that in a few years from now, if technology starts causing, the cost of legal services to drop, like you'll already have the margin to be able to tolerate those shifts. But if you're building your entire practice around billing for time and you have very little margin to essentially lower the amount that you bill for services, you're going to end up being one of these guys who gets caught in that shift. But you can start very easily with like those basic ones and wait to see how the industry moves if you're not like totally bought into the vision we're trying to sell here. Like, there's easy ways to hedge your bets and make sure that you can, protect your firm long term.
All right. Well, we just have a few more minutes here. So let's see. You mentioned one of the 3 products. So let's get to the other 2.
Yeah, so Legalpreneurship is the next one. I think that's probably the simplest. It's a newsletter, soon hoping to branch out into courses and maybe in-person classes, which is specifically to teach the way that lawyers think and that lawyers strategize to entrepreneurs. So that's again what we were sort of talking about, being able to approach a situation with a holistic mindset, understanding your needs, your costs, your benefits, the other side's, costs, benefits, and come up with the best possible solution. I think another aspect of that, which I hope lawyers will appreciate, is that we're really trying to teach people how to talk to lawyers. That's something that I feel is a bit of a disconnect. You hear about people being unable to communicate with developers is like a really common one. Like it's just a different language, and a lot of founders and entrepreneurs feel like that with lawyers a lot of the time, where they'll ask you for advice and they'll just sit there and nod and then just let you make the decision. And I feel like there's a lot of benefit to them actually being able to understand what you're saying, to participate in the conversation and combine the legal knowledge you have with the business knowledge they have to actually come up with a better solution. So that's the second aspect of that. So it's like teaching them how to think like a lawyer and teaching them how to actually communicate and interact with lawyers in a more positive and collaborative manner. And then the third software I'm working on, which is the one that we met through, which is Law for Startups. So as I mentioned, that started just as a collection of documents online. It's grown into a newsletter, which goes out twice a week and provides legal information. So that'll keep people up to date on the latest changes in tech law, privacy law, business law, mainly in the US, but I will cover major laws in Canada and the EU as well. And then the second aspect of that is still the contract generation. So that is where our subscriptions actually come in, which is we're building a SaaS product, which will probably be out around the time this podcast comes out, so in 2 to 3 months from now, and will essentially be a platform where any entrepreneur, my sort of target market is entrepreneurs that are pre-Series A. So the ones who already are struggling to afford a lawyer, who haven't really raised like a significant round, just only maybe have some money from friends and family. And the platform will have templates for safe agreements, employment agreements, template agreements, freelancer agreements, all these different templates. And they'll be able to essentially upload data from a CRM, for example, for all their customers, all their suppliers. They'll be able to upload HR data, so employee names, addresses, salaries, share options if they have those, and auto-generate contracts based off all that information. So the goal is essentially to completely automate the legal side of businesses that are pre-Series A. And the reason I say that, I think this is only going to target pre-Series A companies is, again, $50 a month. I think it provides a lot of value. It essentially provides the ability to generate contracts for almost everything you'll do, from hiring to raising. But I don't think that it will replace a lawyer's advice and input on customized contracts once you actually have money in the bank, right, and those contracts are for significant amounts of money. Like, I think that there's a risk reward proposition there where you're using templates, they haven't been reviewed by lawyers, and it is better than nothing. It's better than spending thousands of dollars that you don't have. But once you have the money in the bank, and I write this in like the newsletters, I think that once people have money in the bank, they really should transition. And to actually support in that transition, what we do is at any point when you want to leave the platform, we'll zip every single contract you've ever had on the platform. So the platform allows both parties to sign the contracts digitally as well. So when you go to a lawyer, once you've raised that first $1 million, all you do is you download a single file. It'll organize all the employment contracts in one folder, all the consulting contracts in one folder, all the advisor contracts, anything to do with shares, anything to do with fundraising, and you'll essentially give this one document to your lawyer, and they'll have every single legal agreement that you've signed as a company. And I think that will also really help lawyers, because a lot of them end up in a position, especially around Series A with high-tech companies, where they're suddenly going back and trying to solve years and years of problems. They have no idea what's been written, what's been signed. So the hope is really that this helps streamline that whole process for entrepreneurs, helps them get everything under control in the early days. And then for lawyers, will actually help them get started and have, very strong foundation again for them to essentially build off of once you get to that Series A point. When building legal products, one of the things that I really try to keep in mind is the way that they're going to interact with lawyers and the legal industry, and making sure that they don't only service the entrepreneurs, but that they actually have a way of taking whatever I'm offering or building and packaging that in a way that makes it easy to then be adapted or built up on by lawyers later down when the company is more mature.
Yeah. I mean, so just some wrap up final thoughts for me on all that is, and we'll start with your most recent one with the subscription that you're going to be doing. If I'm a lawyer and it's not worth my time to help that early of a company because they don't have the money yet to hire me, I feel like that's the thing that lawyers should be sending any startups that come to them, to that kind of a product to get started. It also makes me think of like how Y Combinator and Cooley, they do put like forms on their websites for safes and other things, but they don't do this automation thing that you're going to be offering. And so I think $50 a month is a great value for the automation piece of that, and to be able to hand it off to a lawyer. Going back to legalpreneurship, about teaching entrepreneurs, I feel like there's a lot of value you could potentially provide to legal tech founders who are also not lawyers, who are building legal tech for lawyers to use and are also then have to sell to lawyers their legal tech, right? So like, I mean, you really should look at Tech Show next year, ABA Tech Show in Chicago, February 14th to 17th, and potentially even just coming to the show floor. You don't have to present and you don't have to, I mean, maybe you do. They have a Startup Alley competition. So depending on where you're at, you may want to apply to that competition. And I think they're all tech vendors there, like legal tech vendors. Like that could be a good market for you. And there's an attorney named Mike Whelan who is not practicing law, but he has a Substack called Selling to Lawyers. And I feel like his audience and your audience would go hand in hand in that regard too, if you wanted to serve that market. And my last thought, I'm going to share this link with you, and I hope to see you involved with it too, is your $1contract.com website, I think can be categorized as access to justice tech. Do you think of it that way?
Yeah, we do. I think like I'm kind of in a mentality where I don't want to present it necessarily as replacing legal work yet. I think it's very much trying to help people obviously access legal services that can't afford them. But I don't want to necessarily put someone in a position where they feel that it replaces talking to a lawyer. I think that's a very challenging thing to do at times, is that you're trying to build legal products to support people. But at the same time, it's trying to make it clear to them that this is a lower standard than what you would receive if you went to a lawyer. And there's kind of balancing that. So one of the things I have tried to do is not necessarily reach out to, pro bono companies and whatnot. I do genuinely believe it would benefit the people who come to them, but I'm afraid that you will reach a point where some of these companies will overpromise what the tech can do, and people who come to those services needing genuine legal help will end up getting some AI generated contract that they don't necessarily completely understand, instead of actually getting to talk to a lawyer and getting like the advice and the customized work that they need. So it's kind of balancing those two interests right now, is making sure that people who use it actually understand the limitations of the products as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I still want to make some introductions to some other access to justice tech related people who I know and founders of companies that are doing stuff in that space. And I don't think they necessarily even promote that they're access to justice tech either. But I think there's a lot of potential opportunity there. But with that, Liam, we are almost out of time. And so I'm just going to ask you my final question that I ask all my guests, which is a hot dog a sandwich, and why?
I'm going to say no. I have no clue why. It just doesn't feel like it. It's the same reason a hamburger doesn't feel like a sandwich.
All right, Liam, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Where can everybody find you?
So you can either find me on Twitter. I'm very active there. It's at Lawyer Liam. Very easy to remember. Or you can check out $1contract.com, lawforstartups.com, or my personal website, liamgill.com. All those places will lead back to me eventually.
All right. All the links in the show notes. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks again to 650 and Gavel for sponsoring this show. The best way for others to discover this show is for you to share it with someone you think would find value from it. Follow me on LinkedIn, since that's where I'm most active on social media, and click the bell towards the top right of my profile to get notified about all of my posts about this podcast and everything else I think is valuable for you to see. To get in touch, message me on LinkedIn or email kurbis@lawsubscribed.com. All links are in the show notes. Until next time, this is Matthew Kurbis with Law Subscribed.